Speaking of impact, it's my honor and pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening, Courtney Martin. Courtney is an author, entrepreneur, and facilitator. She's written and edited 5 books, including The New Better Off, Reinventing the American Dream, and Do It Anyway, The New Generation of Activists. She writes frequently for the New York Times, Bright Magazine, and the On Being Project, among other publications. She's appeared on The Today Show, MSNBC, and The O'Reilly Factor, and speaks widely at conferences and colleges. Her TED Talks have been watched over 3.5 million times. Courtney is also the co-founder of the Solutions Journalism Network and Fresh Speakers Bureau, which I encourage you to look up on the web. I did, and it's very interesting, the work you're doing there. And has consulted with a wide variety of organizations like TED, the Aspen Institute, the Obama Foundation, and the Sundance Institute on how to make impactful, story-rich social change. When she isn't working, she's hanging with her neighbors at Temescal Commons, a co-housing community in Oakland, riding bikes with her husband and collaborator John Kerry and her 2 daughters, Stella and Maya. And I also learned, this is all great, but I also learned some other interesting details from Dennis and Sharon, who are here tonight. It's my turn to roast a little bit. I got roasted. So apparently, Courtney is an accomplished slam poetry artist. So was out in New York, showing them how to do it. And also independent filmer, doing some interesting activist work around independent film in Harlem. So thank you for sharing that with me, Dennis and Sharon. So it's my pleasure to invite Courtney up. Thank you for being here.
Oh, man. The only thing worse than having your father at the table with you is having your best professor that you've known for 20 years who tells the person next to him all the secrets about you when you were 19 years old. So right here is Dennis Dalton and Sharon Dalton. Dennis Dalton was my political theory professor at Barnard College in 1999. And yes. And basically, told me at a moment when everyone was too cool for school that my sensitivity and my political outrage were actually levers for social change, something I should protect and nourish. So, yes. So I'm still mad at him for embarrassing me by telling everybody about my slam poetry days, but his mentorship has been a lifetime of goodness. So I want to start, first of all, thank you for having me. It feels like such an honor to be here, and I've been here all day and sitting in and learning from all of you, so it's been a real treat for me. I've lived in cohousing for 6 years, which I'm going to talk more about, but this is my first national conference. So it's been really wonderful to hear so many incredible tactical ideas all day about how to make this thing work that we all do. My talk is not going to be very tactical. You might think of it as sort of like the narrative idea of how to make people understand what cohousing is. I'm sure all of you are in the position I'm in of constantly explaining it and why it matters. So I hope maybe I'm going to give you some tools today in that regard, and also a few provocations, because that's my style. But I want to start, actually, by reading you a children's book, if you're up for it. This is a book that I read my daughters, and I realized better than almost anything else I've ever heard or read, it encapsulates to me what matters about cohousing. So it's called Extra Yarn by Mac Barnett. On a cold afternoon in a cold little town where everywhere you looked was either the white of snow or the black of soot from chimneys, Annabelle found a box filled with yarn of every color. So she went home and knit herself a sweater. And when Annabelle was done, she had some extra yarn, so she knit a sweater for Mars too. But there was still extra yarn. And when Annabelle and Mars went for a walk, Nate pointed and laughed and said, "You two look ridiculous." "You're just jealous," said Annabelle. "No, I'm not," said Nate. But it turned out he was. And even after she'd made a sweater for Nate and his dog and for herself and for Mars, she still had extra yarn. At school, Annabelle's classmates could not stop talking about her sweater. "Quiet," shouted Mr. Norman. "Quiet, everyone. Annabelle, that sweater of yours is a terrible distraction. I cannot teach with everyone turning around to look at you." "Then I'll knit one for everyone," Annabelle said, "so they won't have to turn around." "Impossible," said Mr. Norman. "You can't." But it turned out she could, and she did, even for Mr. Norman. And when she was done, Annabelle still had extra yarn. So she knit sweaters for her mom and dad, and for Mr. Pendleton and Mrs. Pendleton, and for Dr. Palmer, and for little Louis. She made sweaters for everyone except Mr. Crabtree, who never wore sweaters or even long pants, and who would stand in his shorts with the snow up to his knees. "No sweater for me, thanks," said Mr. Crabtree. So she made Mr. Crabtree a hat, and even then, Annabelle still had extra yarn. She made sweaters for all the dogs and all the cats and for other animals too. Soon people thought, soon Annabelle will run out of yarn. But it turned out she didn't. So Annabelle made sweaters for things that didn't even wear sweaters. Things began to change in that little town. News spread of this remarkable girl who never ran out of yarn, and people came to visit from around the world to see all the sweaters and to shake Annabelle's hand. One day, an archduke, who was very fond of clothes, sailed across the sea and demanded to see Annabelle. "Little girl," said the archduke, "I would like to buy that miraculous box of yarn, and I'm willing to offer you $1 million. "No, thank you," said Annabelle, who was knitting a sweater for a pickup truck. The archduke's mustache twitched. $2 million, he said. Annabelle shook her head. "No, thanks." $10 million, shouted the archduke. "Take it or leave it." "Leave it," said Annabelle. "I won't sell the yarn." And she didn't. So that night, the archduke hired 3 robbers to break into Annabelle's house, and they stole the box. Yeah, we can hiss. Hiss. And took it to the archduke, who set off across the snow and sailed over the sea back to his castle. The archduke put on his favorite song and sat in his best chair, and he took out the box and he lifted its lid and he looked inside. His mustache quivered. It shivered, it trembled. The archduke hurled the box out the window and shouted, "Little girl, I curse you with my family's curse. You will never be happy again." But it turned out she was. So it sailed back to her, and she got it back. My daughter, seeing this picture, can I go back? Yeah, said, "Oh, she found a hidden pocket and hid it in that thing that he opened where it was empty." My 5-year-old, I was like, "Yeah, good thinking." So I share this because I believe that the magic that Annabelle possesses in this story, a magic that confuses the rich and powerful and cannot be bought, is very much like the magic of cohousing. When I gave my TED Talk, which I'm sure you all have seen Grace's beautiful TED Talk on cohousing, I gave a TED Talk about my book that in part talked about cohousing. One of the things that I noticed happened to me and Grace, and I haven't been able to talk about if this happened to her, is that at TED conferences, you have the richest, most powerful people in the world. And many of them came up to me and they said, "I loved that cohousing thing you were talking about." And I said, "Oh, really?" And they said, "Yes, I have many homes, but I think I'd like one of them in one of those co-housing communities." And, part of me, I have to admit, was like, maybe we could sell it to this guy and then my parents could live there most of the time. So I was kind of, the wheels were turning. But the amazing thing was that it was so clear that these guys, who are essentially the archdukes of our time, like from this story, didn't understand that you actually couldn't buy it. It wasn't one more thing you could acquire. And that's one of the things I find to be so moving about this community and so moving about this way of living, is that it transcends money. It transcends all these traditional and contemporary norms of power that we have. In a time seemingly defined by a feeling of deprivation, co-housing is countercultural. In a world where it never feels like there is enough money, enough time, enough attention, enough energy, somehow in co-housing there are these moments when the exact thing you most can't figure out or muster the energy for is exactly the thing that someone else is up for. In other words, what I want to explore is my experience, which is backed up by reporting and writing I've done, that co-housing's magic is its capacity to put us in touch with a sense of what I'm thinking of as sacred abundance. There is enough. That is so countercultural, so antithetical to our times. There is enough. There is always enough. I want to talk about 3 forms of sacred abundance that I've experienced and heard so many other people talk about, including people in this room. So as I mentioned, I live in Temescal Commons in Oakland. Yeah, East Bay. I know there are a lot of East Bayers in the house. We're celebrating our 20th anniversary next year. Yeah, it's amazing. Now, I've lived there for 6 of those years, and I can tell you I am deeply grateful to our founders for everything they figured out before we came. For those of you who are founders in the room, you know exactly what I'm talking about. So much labor, so much heartache, so much work that went into figuring out just the right way to live before I got there. So I feel deeply indebted every day. They promised me that our fresh energy is helpful, but I'm like, wow, you guys figured out so much. Our version of co-housing is 9 units, about 25 people of all different ages, professions, and political persuasions. It was started out of a Christian church and is now interfaith. We have 2 common meals a week, Thursday nights and Sunday nights, and 1 community workday a month. So it's fun describing this to you guys, because usually when I'm in a room and I describe co-housing, people are like, what? And you guys are like, yeah, that's about how it works. So that's all of us. Now, this is our incredible garden, and actually my 5-year-old daughter when she was a little bit younger, where we just had a beautiful bounty of ripe red strawberries and will soon have enough blackberries to feed the entire neighborhood. We eat lettuce and kale and artichoke and carrots and snap peas and all kinds of other things straight from here. My daughters are often caught wobbling along the beds, eating basil or mint just straight. They think herbs are actual food. And by the way, I have 0 gardening skills or knowledge. Like, literally haven't even owned a houseplant before that I managed to keep alive. So, who is responsible for this bounty? All the people who live in my community, but this person in particular, Louise, my 80-year-old neighbor who has 7 decades worth of intelligence on how to make things grow, and an inspiring amount of energy to continue to do so. So Louise's black belt in gardening is her extra yarn, right? It's an infinite resource that we all benefit from. No one will starve in our community, but even more, my kids grow up with an understanding of how food grows, even without my capacity to teach them that. Sometimes the sense of sacred abundance is like that, coming in the form of a gift that one of our community members has. Tom knows how to teach kids to read and keep bees. Cheryl knows everything about child development. Randy can fix any appliance over and over and over again. John is a film guru. Nathan can bake the shit out of a pie. So part of the sacred abundance is the way our individual gifts add up to so much more when we harness them collectively. I know all of you experience this on a regular basis. Now, sometimes it shows up in a different way. Imagine the cutest possible baby you could ever imagine sitting in a cardboard box, okay? That's baby Nari, the youngest member of our community, and let's be honest, everyone's favorite. In this picture, she was in a rocket ship, obviously, that my daughters had made out of cardboard. She was born last August to Brian and Christine. Now, having a baby, as every parenting website and book will tell you, can be a deeply isolating and stressful experience. Research on happiness has found that midlife, the time when most of us have children, can be a bit of a valley, that the trajectory of happiness takes a U-shape over the life cycle. The happiest adults, on average, are younger and older. According to the Pew Research Center, parents who gave themselves high ratings as parents were among the most likely to say they were happy with their life. Now, the reverse was true also. I think this is a really important part of the story of co-housing. Just as it takes a village to raise a child, it can also take a village to help a parent feel okay about their parenting. And as the Pew study points out, have a deeper sense of well-being. The magic of proximity and intention is that co-housing communities can make parenting exponentially less daunting. So just to share one story, and there are so many. One lazy Friday afternoon, about a week after baby Nari was born, I was out on the lawn with my two children, mentioned 2 and 5 years old, and Brian came out, the new dad, and said, "Courtney, can you come in?" I said, "Sure, kids are yours." So I go in. Brian, of course, is super bonded with my kids, so they love to hang out with him in the yard. I went in, and Christine was freaking out a little bit about breastfeeding. I mean, far more gracefully than I freak out, but nonetheless, I could tell she was distraught. She couldn't make heads or tails of the lactation consultant's instructions. She couldn't figure out how the manual breast pump worked, so I showed her. They wanted to give the baby a little bit of formula because it was losing weight, but she couldn't even figure out how to mix it properly. She was clearly in that post-birth haze of hormones and overwhelm. I asked her if I could share this because I wanted to be ethical in sharing the story, and she told me, in quotes, "I remember that moment so clearly like it was yesterday, listening to you explain it like it was no biggie, taking sips of your beer, just laxing the whole situation, and I didn't feel like I was making a catastrophic mistake. You wrapped up by saying, 'It's going to be okay.' And of course, the second anyone says that made tears well up. Even though I had my mom there, she had never breastfed, so I was really grateful you were around." Now, I'm not some new mom whisperer, but I was close, I listened, and I reminded her of the big picture. So sometimes extra yarn in co-housing is simply the ability to remind one another of the big picture, particularly if you have the gift of living in intergenerational community. I have had so many tiny moments when either conversation with someone in my community or sometimes just being a witness to one of their lives puts my anxiety and fear and freakouts in perspective. I watch Cheryl and Kate parent teenagers. Sure, I wish my kids would let me go to the bathroom alone, like maybe just once in 2019. But Cheryl and Kate sometimes wish their kids would linger longer and talk more. I am in a resentful place with my husband about some little thing. And then I watch Tom walk dutifully twice a day around the property with Mary, his wife of many years, as she practices rehabbing after her stroke. I'm instantly reminded to be grateful for our health and also so awed by their commitment to one another. When I lost a writing job, Louise, also a writer, both empathized and helped me have perspective. There will be another great outlet. There will be more opportunities, of course, but hearing it from an 80-year-old makes all the difference. Now, the third form of extra yarn is love. Greeks might call it agape, Buddhists might call it metta. The kind of love I'm talking about is unconditional and not defined by blood or attraction, but by commitment. Love constructed not out of lofty ideas or steadfast oaths, but by the simple act of showing up over and over and over again. In person, eating food, weeding gardens, watching basketball games, playing in kiddie pools, just really mundane human stuff. My mentor and friend, Krista Tippett, put it beautifully in her book, Becoming Wise. If we are stretching to live wiser and not just smarter, we will aspire to learn what love means, how it arises and deepens, how it withers and revives, what it looks like as a private good, but also as a common good. I long to make this word echo differently in hearts and ears, not less complicated, but differently so. Love as muscular and resilient. Love as social, not just about how we are intimately, but how we are together in public. I want to aspire to a carnal, practical love. Eros becomes civic, not sexual and yet passionate, full-bodied, because it is the best of which we are capable. Loving is also supremely exacting. Not always, but again and again, love is something we only master in moments. So here's one such moment. There are 4 young kids other than baby Nari currently in our co-housing community, ages 1, 2, 3, and 5. After every common meal, they battle it out over who gets to sweep the floor. Not only does this make everything dirtier, but more importantly, it always ends in tears and every once in a while, a little bit of blood. Not just among the little kids, they were also sometimes unsuspectingly slapping some old person in the head with the end of a broom. So the 4 parents of these 4 children tried to intervene while also attempting to wolf down pasta and salad and maybe have like half of an adult conversation. Everyone was super annoyed by it. One day, we show up to Common Meal to find 4 little dustpans and 4 little brushes, about this size, right? And each one has a kid's name on it. The aunties witnessed and problem solved. The kids were over the moon. The parents got to eat full meals that night. No blood was shed. Is it the Sistine Chapel? Is it an all-expense-paid trip to Disney World? No. Is it something my kids even registered as special? No. And that's the point. They get so much non-familial, loving witness on such a regular basis that it seems normal to them to be seen, to be loved, no matter your developmental stage or rotten mood or 23andMe results. Call it the auntie effect. These are our aunties, Cheryl and Kate. It's totally extra yarn. That kind of love and attention isn't finite. But when we live in our own little worlds, when we think the only people that really matter are those within the 4 walls of our homes, we miss out on this. We get depleted. We run out of ideas and energy and sweetness. We feel alone, and we are structurally. When we live in co-housing, we live together for all the mess and beauty that it is. We live with sacred abundance. So these are our 3 forms: gifts, perspective, and love. Now, lest this sound Pollyannish, I want to balance these 3 forms of sacred abundance with 3 provocations for our movement, and I include myself in this. So how do we leverage that extra yarn for everybody, not just the mostly white, mostly middle class or above people who might fill this room today? So everyone look around. This is not America, okay? This will increasingly not be America. We've got to take that seriously. New census population projections confirm that what we today refer to as racial minorities are the primary demographic engine of the nation's future growth. By 2045, white people will be the minority, 49.7% of the population. In contrast, 24.6% Hispanic, 13.1% Black, 7.9% Asian, 3.8% multiracial population. So the co-housing movement not only needs to figure out how to be of service to young people of color, but to be shaped by young people of color. And how do we make co-housing communities where people of a variety of demographic backgrounds feel like they actually belong? We cannot fall back on what journalist Nicole Hannah-Jones calls curated diversity, trying to get a few people of color in our overwhelmingly white mix so we, the white people, feel better about ourselves. It's not fair to those people of color. They are still being subjected to white norms, not to mention our own unexamined racism. Belonging is different. It's textured and hearty and brave. It's where white people let go of some control. Okay, the second one I got a major schooling on this morning, so I just feel like I should pull that panel up here and be like, just talk for 5 minutes, but how do we make co-housing affordable and accessible? The structural and financial barriers are substantial. They're daunting, as all of you know. And we have to keep iterating and sharing best practices and figuring out where the leverage points are for making policy shifts. We simply don't have the right financial mechanisms that make it easy for people of modest means to set up co-housing communities. You all know this. You're living it. I don't need to tell you. For most of us, it has required some modicum of wealth to get a community off the ground. Even the time and energy it takes to create a co-housing community is, in a sense, a privilege that most people from lower economic classes simply do not have. So as I said, I went to the panel on affordability today, blew my mind. I couldn't even keep up. I was like trying to write notes. So we need to keep sharing information about these experiments and the intelligence they surface nationwide. We need to stop making excuses. It's hard, but it's not impossible. And people have never been more critical of late-stage capitalism or the brokenness of the housing industry. People are ready to do radical things. Okay, so my final provocation: how can our co-housing communities resist spiritual materialism and insularity. If we know that there is sacred abundance in caring beyond the four walls of our own homes, then we logically know that there is sacred abundance in caring beyond the fences and gates and blackberry bushes of our own communities. There is enough. There has to be. But how do we make that real? So I, for example, live 1 block away from a homeless encampment, and my community can't come to any kind of consensus on how to interact with the people there. We say it's because we are politically and religiously diverse. We have different ideas about what causes homelessness and who's responsible. There's plenty of strategic stuff we could battle about. Housing first approaches versus other kinds of approaches, religious versus governmental intervention. But what are we doing for the actual humans? The answer so far, I'm embarrassed and ashamed to say, is nothing. We claim to be a community built on radical hospitality, and homelessness is rampant in our own city, and we haven't done anything about it as a collective group. I drive by that encampment every single day with my 2 young daughters and say nothing. And that's bullshit. Because I'm trying to nurture their compassionate instincts and their instincts for outrage, and yet I'm numbing them out to the closest possible source. How do we leverage our common spaces for people who may not want to live in co-housing but need gathering space? The whole point of co-housing is to complicate our ideas about the American religion of private commodities. How do we share our wealth, not just physically, but ideologically? How do we have hard conversations and good work and great art fill our common houses? In our co-housing, we have experimented with this in a lot of ways. We've been trying to use our common house as this center of good works that have nothing to do with our works. So we've had local teachers there to celebrate. We've had criminal justice reformers retreat there. We've had all kinds of organizers and activists use our common house in recent years who just need literally a room to plot in, right? It's small, but it feels right. I want to figure out ways to do more of it. Space matters, particularly in an increasingly unaffordable housing market like the one I live in Oakland, California, and I'm sure like the one so many of you all live in. So in closing, this is what I'm trying to say. The worst thing we could do is pat ourselves on the back for our extra yarn and then knit infinite sweaters for those who live within our communities. It might feel cozy, but it's not right. We have to keep showing up for one another and honoring the importance of that, and that is no easy thing. To show up for 20 people is a huge thing. And we have to keep questioning where and how we share the sacred abundance beyond our comfort zones. We have to open up. We have to invite in. We have to challenge one another's assumptions, knowing that our relationships are resilient and worth the learning. There are so many reasons to live in co-housing and to persevere through these provocations. The research is now there thanks to the Cohousing Research Network. Where are you, peeps? Woo! 96% of co-housers report an improved quality of life. 75% feel their physical health was better than others their age. We report a greater connection to nature, a greater involvement in civic or political action. We vote at twice the rate of the average American. And beyond the research, we now have this really exciting thing, which is the first generation of kids who grew up in co-housing who are now adults, making their way through the world. So I was fascinated by this, so I interviewed a bunch of them for a piece I wrote recently. And I was so moved by the ways they described how they'd been shaped by growing up this way. I want to end by sharing one of those stories. This is Ravenna, the one on the right. Ravenna Koenig, who grew up in Vashon co-housing. Is Vashon in the house? Yay! Do you guys know Ravenna? Yay! Okay. So Ravenna was a senior in college. She had felt at a loss about how to pursue the adult life, which I can very much relate with. I've had multi-year crises of what the heck does the adult American life look like. She had a hunch she wanted to be a radio reporter, but the rest seemed a little fuzzy. How does one get there? Where does one live? How does one live? So she decided to interview the adults in her co-housing community. And this is from her. She said, I asked questions about career, relationship, faith, purpose, doubt. One person I interviewed was editor of our local paper, another was a teacher, another a farmer turned videographer, another a builder, another a stay-at-home mother. But they'd done all kinds of jobs and had all kinds of varied experiences that shaped them, each conversation unspooled in a very different direction. So Ravenna, who's now 28 and a public radio reporter in Alaska, although I think she's looking for a job again, right, guys? Yeah. Journalism is not a very steady job, people. Summed it up really beautifully. She said after sitting on these porches and in kitchens and living room couches for hours upon hours interviewing her neighbors, she realized that there was no template for adulthood. In her words, I learned that there is no one right way to live, that loss and failure and doubt are part of the package, that love finds its way to you in surprising and humbling ways, and that adulthood is a made-up thing that never actually arrives. She went on, and as wise and valuable as all of that was, I think the bigger takeaway from those conversations was just that they made me feel loved. Wisdom is a gift, and they were willing to sit with me and give it. So there it is again, that sacred abundance. Thank you all for everything you do every day in your communities to nurture it and spread it. I wish you a lifetime of extra yarn. Thank you.